Hey, welcome back to our special continued coverage here for the Russian election 2024. Rory Souchet, Rachel Rubel, and Caleb Maupin, our senior U.S. correspondent. If you're not in Washington, you're in New York. If you're not in New York, you're in Washington. You're always up and down the eastern seaboard, mate. Look, it's a predictable first question because you're the best one to ask it too. How is the Russian election result going down in D.C.?
Well, they're not thrilled, as you can imagine. In the lead up to this election, it was pretty clear they didn't want it to happen. They don't consider it legitimate. We actually heard the U.S. State Department go as far as saying that they would hold accountable those who observed it, like myself. I was an observer of the election. And it's pretty wild because the argument they have against the election really just comes down to the fact that the Russian president has been in office a long time. And I always remind people that in the United States, we have a very beloved president named Roosevelt. And he was elected in 1932 and 1936, elected again in 1940, and elected again in 1944. And why? Because one, he enacted a lot of economic reforms that really improved people's lives. And number two, he unified the country to defeat the Nazis and, stand with the Soviet Union and China against fascism. So he was widely loved. And, both of my grandparents on both sides, they were Republicans. But for them, Roosevelt was just the president. He was above politics. He was kind of a symbol of what had gotten them through the period of the Great Depression and the Second World War. And so if you look at that and you look at that history, we're not taught in the United States that Roosevelt was a dictator. No one considers him to be a dictator. It's just that he was a leader that stood and, seized the moment and delivered and achieved great things and became kind of the symbol of national victory and national recovery. And I think that's a way we can look at this election when looking at it through an American lens. Of course, U.S. leaders don't want to put it that way.
Putin has been in power for a long time. This will be his fifth presidential term. I know that you, Caleb, you took part in the World Youth Forum earlier this month in Sochi. A lot of young people, they don't know a Russia without Putin. And Putin, let's be honest, he's not a young guy. He's 71 years old. How do young people feel about him?
Well, I got to tell you, when I had the opportunity to be in the room with the Russian president, with 300 other young people in the Atom Hall there in Sochi at the World Youth Festival, and I got the opportunity to ask him a question, there's just something about him. He has this way of engaging with people. He has this charm that it's really hard to put your finger on. I don't think it comes across through television. You have to be in the room with him. You can see this is somebody who really takes politics seriously and has a really deep understanding of how human beings relate to each other and how societies develop over time. I thanked him for his very dynamic interview with Tucker Carlson because I said it showed a different kind of leadership. In the United States, politics is all about sound bites and scandal and gossip. That's not the approach he takes. He draws from the history of this country and of this region going back thousands of years, developing a more scientific view of statecraft.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to jump in quickly because, when you go back to Tucker Carlson sitting down with Putin, one of the things I think, one of the big tsunamis that came off that was the fact that people in the West, particularly Americans, were given the opportunity to realize that Putin is, a very well-spoken man. He's a very intelligent man, very well-educated. He knows his history. He knows all of his economics. He throws out numbers all day long. And there's poor old Joe Biden, who doesn't know what he had for breakfast today, right?
Indeed. I mean, it's frightening to see Joe Biden. And also, what's even more frightening is his vice president, Kamala Harris, is less popular than he is.
Yeah, terrifying.
Which is how can you be less popular than Joe Biden is? So, it's very frightening to look at. And, you have Kamala Harris and you see her on the cameras where she's just kind of repeating these phrases.
And cackling.
I mean, this is very disturbing. And, people look at Donald Trump and, there's a possibility that he could win coming up. I think it's a very big possibility he could win at the polls. But it seems like our political establishment in the United States has circled their wagons and said that won't happen. Now, a lot could change between now and November when we have the U.S. presidential election, but it's not looking good. And, being here and seeing the election here and then contrasting it to the election I'll be covering in a few months in the United States, it makes one do a lot of thinking about different types of civilizations.
Caleb, the Communist Party candidate in this election came in second. I know in the West, when we hear the term communist or communism, we go, ooh, bad, scary. But I'm just wondering, what's the appeal here with the communist legacy in the country? I mean, is it the legacy really, or is there a new appeal to this?
Well, it's interesting because the Communist Party is one political party. But you can see, especially in light of the special military operation, there's a lot of nostalgia for the achievements of the Soviet Union and defeating the Nazis, inventing space travel, industrializing the country. It's funny because in the United States, you'll have people say, well, haven't you ever talked to anyone who actually lived under communism? Well, if you're here in Russia, many people refer to the Communist Party as being the party of the pensioners and the retirees, people who do remember, and that the fall of the Soviet Union was certainly a devastating moment in Russia's history. So you can understand the widespread nostalgia, but at the same time, I mean, this is not the Soviet Union anymore. I mean, that's very clear. I mean, and I see a lot of religious imagery here too. The Soviet Union was a very atheistic state, but I see a lot of love for Christianity. I see a lot of religious imagery and
Beautiful
religious
churches
references.
all over the place.
Absolutely.
Gorgeous churches here.
Absolutely.
Caleb, sorry, carry on.
Oh no, I was just saying. I mean, it's interesting that that Russia draws from many aspects of its past
Yeah, it really
to
does.
present itself in our time. Yeah.
And you talk about the past, but the present and the future. You were down at the annual Youth Forum Festival down in Sochi. I was there as well. 30,000 students, basically, and 5,000 volunteers. It was an enormous turnout. And you think, was it 10 years or more ago, that you had the Winter Olympics down there in Sochi? So you have all this infrastructure, these stadiums, and all this. So you can send thousands of people there. One thing that touched me was that when I was speaking to the students, they weren't just Russian. They had come from all over the world. When I was speaking to them, there was this energy. I could feel this kind of enthusiasm, this optimism. It was like they were looking at like a sunrise. They had this amazing excitement for the future. Where is that coming from? How do you read into that?
Well, I would say that probably a big source of that was the crew of young Russian volunteers that were there. They mobilized young people from all over this country, from many different regions, to be there and guide us around and take us to different places and to be full of enthusiasm and giving us high fives every morning as we're on our way to the festival. And I thought about, in the United States, I don't know if our government would be able to get a crowd of young people to be that way, to work together, to deal with the stresses of that festival, because it was certainly, I can imagine when you have, 188 different countries, delegations from them, getting them everywhere, getting them where they need to go, getting everyone their food and getting them to the hotels and getting them their badges and their identifications could be very stressful. But that crew of young people, thousands of young patriotic Russian volunteers who made it their mission to kind of solidify Russia's friendship with youth from different countries around the world. I was very, very impressed with the enthusiasm, with the endurance, with the patience of those volunteers.
Yeah, well said.
This, of course, this election is very important, a big election here, of course, but of course we have the U.S. presidential election coming up later this year. Do you think the result of this election will have any impact on the U.S. presidential election? And how will the U.S. election have an impact on relations with Russia, you think?
Well, I think one thing that's very clear, and I think a good sign of this has been Victoria Nuland's recent resignation.
Oh, yeah, goodbye.
Is that this Ukraine conflict is not something Joe Biden wants to take to the polls with him in November. The American public is just not with him on this. Billions and billions of dollars for Ukraine, while our roads and bridges are falling apart, while our education system in the United States is a joke. This is not something Joe Biden wants to be a topic of conversation in November. Now, I'm curious, because Donald Trump seems to be having it both ways. He says, well, the conflict never would have happened if he'd been president. Well, I mean, it's happening. So, that's kind of a moot point. He says, well, he can resolve it. But then other times he's saying he wants more weapons in Ukraine. It's not clear where Trump really stands on this. But what is interesting to me is that the American foreign policy establishment has decided they don't like Donald Trump. John Bolton said that if Donald Trump were ever reelected, that would be the end of the NATO alliance. So that's shocking words to me.
Well, look, there may be some truth to that. Frankly, Trump has said if you don't pay your part, then what's the point? But this is one of the things. All right, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm a fan of Trump, okay? But I am going to say this: when it's become so blatantly obvious that the establishment hates him, if the establishment hates Trump, then you know what? I like him.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way of putting it when you look at it, because at this point we have an establishment in Washington that is so out of touch with what the American people want and is so determined to antagonize and isolate and do everything they can to hurt Russia. So anything that might hurt that establishment has a strong argument in its favor.
Yeah, along those lines, Putin kind of made a bit of a dig in his speech last night, saying that the Russian election was more democratic than the U.S. election. Is there any truth to that?
Well, yes, because
I would say so.
in this election, every region was included. Every single one. Every part of Russia got to vote. In the United States, our presidential elections, Puerto Rico has no say in who the president of the United States is. Guam, American Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands. There's millions of Americans who live in these territories. They have absolutely no input. And also, let's add that the voting for the president was direct. Every vote was counted, whereas in the United States, we have this thing called the Electoral College, where you vote for your state, and then your state casts their vote. So it's not a direct election. I also was surprised to know that here in Russia, if you've been convicted of a crime and you're doing time in prison, they have a special voting booth in the prison so that you can vote.
Yeah.
If you're in the hospital getting medical treatment, they have a special voting booth in the hospital.
Nice.
We don't have anything close to that in the United States. In many states in the United States, if you commit a crime, you can't vote for the rest of your life. Just forget about voting for the rest of your life. Now, some states are changing that. It's different by state. So this election was far more inclusive. Just basic things.
Yeah.
It was a national holiday and a weekend. Right? You had 3 days to vote, national holiday weekend. In the United States, we have one day to vote, unless you want to vote absentee. And that day is a Tuesday, and it's not a national holiday. It's a work day. And in big cities, there's huge lines in the morning before work to vote, huge lines in the evening. Russia wanted participation on the part of its population.
It tells you something, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It really does.
It really does.
Just quick, let me ask you this, Caleb. You know, you live in America, you work in America. I know it's not your first time here in Russia, but flying in from the United States here, getting into the airport, going through immigration, passport control, have you had any issues? Have you had any problems, any complaints, any eyes wide open moments?
Well, when I went to the planning meeting of the World Festival in November, on the way back, I had my bag searched and got the special treatment from U.S. Customs.
Welcome home.
Yes,
Right?
you know,
always fun.
U.S. officials have made it clear they don't appreciate the work I do at RT, and they don't appreciate the fact that I'm coming here. And I mean, we just heard the State Department saying how much they really appreciate our U.S. observing of this election. And I think it's really great that other Americans have come here to observe. You know, Dan Kovalik, Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, and others. I think it's really great that we're here observing this election and telling the truth about it, because when you really get down to the details of how the election was carried out, this was very clearly a legitimate and fair election. They want to just kind of cast innuendo and present this story of, oh, Putin's been in office for so long, that can't be democracy. But if you look at the details, this was a very, very clear, fair election, very transparent process. I was in the civic chamber. I saw how every polling station has cameras in it, 2 cameras in it, monitoring it 24 hours a day to make sure there's no foul play. I mean, there's a huge level of transparency here. U.S. officials don't want that version of events out there.
Yeah, they don't want anyone seeing through cameras who's stuffing the ballot boxes and all this kind of stuff. Rachel, any more questions for
I
Caleb?
just really quickly wanted to ask, because it's not a surprise that we have not had words of congratulation coming out of the White House for President Putin's victory. I do remember when the last presidential election, when Putin was reelected, Trump's staff gave him a note saying, "Do not congratulate." And then Trump got on the phone and called Putin and congratulated him. I mean, what are your thoughts on the difference here?
Well, again, there are differences within the U.S. establishment when it comes to Russia. Now, there are a lot of folks in the Trump camp that say the USA could get along with Russia and then team up with Russia against China. But anyone who knows anything about economics knows that's not going to happen. Russia and China are closer than ever in terms of economics right now. It's a relationship based on trade. You know, during the Cold War, it was a political difference and the Sino-Soviet split and Henry Kissinger. We can talk about that in history. But right now, Russia and China are economically closer together than ever. And that bond has been solidified by U.S. sanctions on both countries, right? You cut off both countries, they're going to trade more and more with each other. So there are differences within the U.S. establishment about how to deal with Russia. Some of it could just be basic. I think, you know, China is an industrial manufacturing hub. So the manufacturers in the USA see China as more of a rival, whereas Russia is an energy giant, oil and gas. So I think maybe the big oil companies and the natural gas companies see Russia more as a competitor and more of a threat. So it's just a question of who's paying the piper, which sections of the establishment are having the upper hand. But at the end of the day, I mean, there is a faction in the Pentagon, and you have the neocons and others that they just want U.S. dominance, period. They don't care if it's Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea. They don't want any country around the world that'll challenge them. And the BRICS, the rising new economy coming out of the East and coming out of all these different countries that are trading with each other and kind of saying no to the sanctions regime and international finance, this is the future, and it's a future that I think U.S. leaders need to just kind of come to terms with. There's a new
Well,
economy rising,
I
and
think
we'd be
they're
better off
terrified,
trading
Caleb.
with it.
I think they're terrified, mate. I
Yeah.
mean, just quickly, China is the factory of the world. Russian energy is fueling the Chinese factories, basically. All right. So, we see they're so intertwined now. But you talk about the multipolar world and the global south and how it really is. Look, already the BRICS group already represents more in global GDP than the G7. And yet there are now 20 or 30 more countries that want to join the BRICS. So forget it, G7. You're done. You're done and dusted, mate. It's a whole new multipolar world. And good luck jumping on the train that's already left the station. Caleb Maupin is our senior U.S. correspondent, always up and down the eastern seaboard. It's so good to have you
Yeah,
here,
good to have you in
back at the
person.
mothership in Moscow. Caleb Maupin, do stick around. We'll speak to you soon, all right?
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.